let me pull up the sermon evaluation form and share it with you guys. All right, here we go. I'll put you guys up there. All right. So here it is. Okay. And if we were together, if we had been able to meet together, we would have all used this form for each other. So what I'd like to do is just go through it, and we'll cover some of these very quickly, but I do want to spend a moment on a couple of them just to give some thoughts. And again, if you have any questions or anything isn't clear, please ask. Like I said, this form will have much that is similar to the evaluation for epistles, but there are a few unique parts as well, which focus on narrative. Okay, so with that, let me just get started. As you remember, the sermon, the basic form is there's an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, right? And then the introduction, that's where you're starting, you're introducing your topic. And then, of course, the body is the main part of the sermon. And then the conclusion is, of course, again, short and as you bring your sermon to a close. All right, so introduction. Again, the key components, the key elements of an introduction. The first one is getting the attention of the hearers. And let me expand this size here a little bit so it's easier to see. Hopefully. Can you guys see that okay? Clear? All right. So the one to highlight here, did the preacher get the attention of the hearers? All right, this is very important. So you'll be evaluated on this. You know, how well do you get the attention of the hearers? Obviously, let's see, there's some background noise. Make sure you guys are muted if you can. I'm getting some background noise. Unless you have a question, of course. But starting off the sermon, again, getting the attention of the hearers is very important. And, you know, there are many good ways to do that. I think an effective way is obviously maybe starting with a story or personal account. Now, with narrative, some of the challenges in getting attention is, you know, you're going to be telling a story. So sometimes, you know, you may not want to open the sermon with a story. You certainly can, but sometimes that can be something to consider. And so maybe sometimes I might ask a question related to the story. Like, for example, when I taught on John 9, it was about the blind man that Jesus had healed. So that message, I just started out with something like, what do you think it would be like to be blind? What would it like to live in a world where there's complete darkness? You know, so I started that sermon just on the topic of blindness, but, you know, asked a question or about that. Or I could have mentioned a story. I have a friend whose daughter is blind, and so I could have talked about her a little bit with his permission, of course. But the idea is getting the attention of the hearers, and I think it's important that we don't forget how significant this is, because people are often distracted. People are often thinking about something else, and it's important that we can grab their attention, but do it in a way that brings them to the topic of the sermon. Okay? And so that's what this first, in the introduction, that's one of the key elements is we want to get the attention of the hearers. All right? And then the second key part of that is to surface a need in the hearers. All right? Are you addressing some need that is relevant to their lives? And that's where questions can be helpful. You know, to draw them in, to identify what is important about the topic you're going to discuss today. Why should they listen to you? Yes, it's the Word of God, of course, but sometimes people need to have questions asked or identify particular needs or issues that they can relate to, that they can see, oh, this is something I need to hear. Pastor's not just going to tell some story. He's going to address an issue that is in my life, or an issue that we are confronted with. So it's important that you recognize that. Not only are we to get the attention, but then we need to surface a need. We need to identify something in your hearer's life, whether it's a specific issue or problem, a general condition, or of course, these days, COVID is so dominant. Many people are relating their passages, in terms of addressing these issues with COVID, and that's perfectly fine. That's a need, that's an issue that faces, everybody right now. So that's the second aspect of it, all right, of the introduction. One, get their attention. Secondly, surface the need, all right? And the idea is, again, what is it that will draw them to want to listen, all right? Another important aspect, especially in consideration of in narratives, once you've surfaced the need, you're now drawing them to the passage specifically. And so sometimes it's important to introduce that passage, to introduce the background context, those elements that are going to be helpful in giving us the setting of the passage, okay? And that's part of the fourth one, which is the transition to the body of the sermon. All right, so you're drawing them towards the text. Okay, that's why I don't read the passage at the beginning. You can do that, but I think I don't want to use that to get the attention, because sometimes people are still scattered. They're not paying attention. So I want to get their attention first and then lead them to the passage, so that by the time I get to reading the text, everybody's there. Everybody's listening, hopefully. Everybody's paying attention. So that's why I wait before I read the passage, because that's the most important part to me of the introduction is the text. So I want to make sure everybody's ready to receive the text. It'd be kind of like if you invited people over to dinner, and as people are sitting down, or getting ready or getting a drink, and you just start eating. Well, not everybody's ready. You want people sit down. You want people have their food there and their drink. You want everyone to be prepared so that you may eat together. I mean, the meal is the key part of the experience. And so you've invited them over for that meal. So it's important to make sure everybody's prepared and ready. And in the same way, you're going to bring a plate of food out, of spiritual food out to your hearers as you preach. You want to make sure everybody's sitting at the table. Everybody is waiting and anticipating that meal that's going to be brought to them. You don't want to rush it. And so that's why I wait before I bring the reading of the text to them. Okay. So that covers some of the key elements of the introduction. Are there any comments or any questions about that? Those are the things that we're looking for in an introduction. Get attention, surface a need, and draw them, transition to the text. All right. Any questions? Any comments on that?
Pastor Ken.
Yeah.
So the background is included in the introduction.
Yes. And you don't have to include everything, but as you're introducing the passage, it's helpful to, mention maybe who wrote the book, or maybe the circumstances that it was written in. That's just, but I would do that in the introduction usually, because you're introducing the passage. So that's part of that process. So after I get the attention of the hearers, after I surface the need, and then I say, so turn with me to, Jonah chapter 3. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 4. And so I'll have them read that. And then at that point is when I might draw in some of the background context or some of the setting to get their minds knowing what was going on around the passage, so to speak. Okay? Because when I get to the body of the sermon, that's when I'm actually walking through the passage. So I'm trying to get them enough information so they understand the setting of the passage. And be careful with that too. Don't make it a history lesson. You know, so that takes, you know, some skill and wisdom. You know, sometimes you need to include more information, but sometimes less. It just depends on the situation. Like, for example, in the book of Ruth, if you're teaching out of Ruth, I think the background's very important. So I would spend a little bit of time talking about the time of the judges, because that's significant to the story. Because here you have Naomi and Ruth, who are widows with no one in their life to care for them in a very bad time in Israel's history. Okay? So for the story of Ruth, that's significant. In Jonah, it would be helpful to talk about the Assyrians a little bit. And so how I would do Jonah is, you know, come up with get the attention of the hearers, surface the need, and then I might read the first verse or two from that chapter and then stop there and go back to sort of the setting, you know, talk about the Ninevites a little bit and why, you know, who were they, and because that's going to be significant for the story and why Jonah didn't want to preach to them. Okay, so you just have to decide how much information is important for your hearers to understand. Now, some books, a lot of people know a lot already, and you don't have to give much detail. Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
a question regarding with the preferred time limit of introduction. Is it the same for epistle, or there is a particular time limit for the narrative for introduction?
Yeah. Again, this is just me. There's no rules here, but I try to keep my introductions short, 5 minutes or so, regardless of the type of, whether it's epistle or narrative. Now, there's a couple situations where you want to extend that introduction a little bit. One is if there's a lot of background to the book or passage that you need to tell them, to give them a right foundation as you go through the passage. So you might need to go a longer introduction. A second reason for a longer introduction may be the need. As you're surfacing the need, you may need to take more time on that. For example, I preached a message recently on unity from Philippians. And I spent quite a bit of time talking about the concerns with unity in the church in today's situation, with the virus, with the racial tension in the United States, with the election. There are a lot of issues that I spent a little time addressing, how, and not just from our society, but how they've impacted the church. Because I wanted to make sure people recognized how significant this issue of disunity is right now. And so I spent probably a third of my sermon was an introduction in that case. But I don't do that often. I usually want to get to the text. And so I would say for me, probably 80% of the time, my introduction is 5 minutes or less. Okay, that's me. There are some, like John MacArthur, he usually has long introductions because he spends a lot of time surfacing the need. And so he's very good at sort of identifying issues in the culture or problems and how this passage is going to answer or address those problems. But I think, he's good at it. I think for a lot of us, if we spend too much time on the introduction, we won't have enough time for the passage. And it's more important, I think, that they hear from the scripture, but we want to make sure we are bringing them to the scripture in a good way. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Makes sense.
there's no rule. It's not like if you have a long introduction, it's a bad sermon. That's not the case. But if you do have a long introduction, it better be good. Okay.
Okay.
So
So I just thought that uh, doing an introduction with the narrative and doing introduction with the epistle is a different uh, you know kind or different approach or different something like that is I think narrative is most likely you going to make a introduction longer or like in the epistle it's shorter because it's a different kind of genre something like that. So
yeah, no,
you
it's a
answered it.
good question. No, I think for me, probably I haven't really examined it, but my introduction for narrative is probably shorter for me
Shorter. Okay.
because I'm going to be telling the story.
Yeah.
And usually I try to make my narrative sermons inductive. That is, I don't tell them the main idea at the beginning. I lead
Okay.
them to it through the story. So I don't want to spend a lot of time at the beginning, except to set the setting, give the setting of the story. So like I said, I might, like with the blind man on John 9, I just sort of got people thinking about blindness a little bit. And then I said, well, blindness was, many people had struggled with blindness in the Bible. And we're going to see a story today of when Jesus encountered a man who was born blind. And so I didn't even give any indication of what the actual theological or spiritual topic was. I just sort of gave a very short introduction to this idea of blindness and what did Jesus do when he met a blind man. And well, let's look in John 9 together and see. And then I gave a little bit longer introduction to John 9. Okay, where are we at in this gospel? What has just happened? Jesus was just in the temple and he'd been preaching, and the Pharisees wanted to get rid of him, and so Jesus, so I kind of gave a little bit of the setting in the introduction, but I didn't give a story at the beginning. I just made it very, very short.
Okay.
Again, because I like to try to do inductive sermons for narrative, so I don't want to give away too much at the beginning. I want the
Yeah.
story for them to sort of begin to see the main point as they go through the story. I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.
Makes sense.
All right. Any other questions about the introduction? As you can see, guys, it's 12 points out of the 100. It's for the introduction. So, so it's not a significant part of the overall grade for the sermon, but you need to, it is important. Obviously, the body of the sermon next is more significant, more important. It's a larger portion of the sermon. And so it's a third of your grade is on the body. And here the focus is on clarity. How clearly did you present the passage? Later on, we'll look at the exegesis. The focus there is accuracy. Okay? So again, that is a third of your grade, is on the exegesis. Basically, how accurate were you? Okay? That's the focus of the exegesis. The focus of the body of the sermon is how clear were you? How compelling were you? Okay? That's the focus on the grading for the body of the sermon. Now, obviously, the exegesis is what will come into the body of your sermon. That's what informs you of what the text means. But I'm just showing you on the grading form, we separate those two things out in evaluating how your sermon is. Okay, so let's look at the body of the sermon. Again, that is where you'll present, a bulk of the text. Now with epistles, remember we had the outline points, and then you had, for each outline point, you had the point, the proof, the picture, the plan, and the problem. Where the point is stating the point, the proof is explaining it from the text. the plan is or the picture is the illustration, and then the plan is the application. It's a little different with narratives. Again, with narratives, you're going to be following the scenes of the story, and you're going to be telling the story. Okay, so it's not, you don't need to have a point, proof, picture, plan, problem for each scene. Really, for a story, I think the most effective sermons are just tell the story, and really it's at the end. If you're preaching an inductive sermon, by the way, I forgot to mention that here. There's a note here. For an epistle, normally we would have a point here that would say, did the preacher give the main point of his sermon? Okay. That's with the epistle. We don't have that here for the narrative, because in a narrative, if you preach it inductively, you won't state your main point at the beginning. Now you can, if you want to do a deductive sermon, that's okay. If you want to say today's message, we're going to see a story from Scripture about the wrath of God and his what God thinks about sin, and we'll find this story in in Exodus chapter 32. So you can do that. That would be deductive sermon. You give your point up front, and then you show it. But an inductive sermon might be, what is God's view of sin? How does God feel about sin? Well, we're going to see an example of this in Exodus chapter 32. So you open up the idea or the thought, but you don't give them the answer yet. And I think that makes for an effective narrative sermon, because that's what a story is. A story, you just start reading the story. You're not usually told the point of the story at the beginning. It usually comes at the end. So I think that's a good way to do it. And that's why I'm encouraging you guys to try this. Try just telling the story. And then at the end, you'll have really the main point and the application. Okay. Now, so that's just why I put this note here. For narrative text, it's recommended to preach an inductive sermon. Again, notice the word recommended. I'm not saying you have to, but I really want to encourage this. I'll give you extra points if you do. Recommended to preach an inductive sermon where the main point of the story and its implications are explained at the end. So, for example, if you did an inductive sermon on Exodus 32, the golden calf, and as you walk through the passage, by the end of the passage, you will be answering the question, how does God feel about sin? He will respond in judgment. And then you might talk about application. Well, what does that mean for us? Well, if you're not a Christian, right, you might address that. What does it mean for a believer? Do believers, are they under the wrath of God? Well, here's where I would introduce the problem or the question. Believers are not under the wrath of God. Why is that? Because of what Jesus has done. He took upon himself the wrath of God. So that's where I would go with that. I might address two groups in terms of application, but I wouldn't state the main idea up front. I would lead them to it at the end, and that's where I would focus on application. Okay? So in the body of the sermon, I'll talk more about that. What's important, we're talking about narrative here. So in the body of the sermon, did the preacher tell the story accurately and clearly? Okay? Now, what I've seen with narrative passages, I've often seen preachers sort of take the main idea and have a sermon on the main idea, but not really tell the story that much. Just sort of allude to it along the way. Like for example, Exodus 32, you might have a sermon on the wrath of God, and you focus on God's wrath, and then you just talk about certain ways we see his wrath in the story, but never really tell the story. And I think you want to do it the other way around. You want to tell the story, and how you do that is you go scene by scene. that's my my approach, my recommendation. So instead of having outline points where you have 3 points to your message, 3 points, 3 characteristics of the wrath of God from Exodus 32. My recommendation would instead to be break up the story into its scenes and then walk them through each scene. All right? Because I think the original author wasn't, he's telling the story. Moses was telling the story. And he told it by going through scenes. He did not have the story as 3 characteristics of the wrath of God. Okay? Instead, he told of, the first events when Moses was away up on the mountain. And as he was away, Aaron collected gold and, formed this calf from the fire. And then he comes back and he sees the people were, in, immorality and worshiping this false god and this calf. And then Moses' response. But it was told by way of scenes. And I think that's an effective narrative sermon is done in the same way. All right. You tell the scene, identify anything in the scene that your hearers may not understand well, or does the narrator say anything in that scene that is significant? What issues are in that scene that are connected to the main point? And so you want to draw your attention to your readers about that. For example, if you're preaching through Exodus 32 and you're in the scene where Aaron's making the golden calf, you might ask a few questions like, now, what do you think God's going to think of this? Is there anything God had said recently about making an idol? So I might ask a few questions that are significant to the main point of the story, but I don't answer them yet. I just sort of put it out there. And that's why I have this third statement. Did the preacher ask questions to draw his hearers into the story? Questions can be very effective, especially the why questions. All right, so be thinking about that as you go through the story. The narrator is going to point some things out in the story. Do you draw attention to those things? Again, you're not just telling the story, but you're also helping the people to learn how to read biblical narrative. All right. And they will learn from watching how you preach these stories. They'll learn how then to read narratives. And so if you walk through the story, telling it scene by scene, that's how they're going to read a story. But if you go through the narrative and just pick out some certain verses and teach on the theology of those verses without really explaining the story, that's how they're going to read narrative in the Bible. They're just going to look for doctrinal things in the story and not really read it as a story. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think I've said this before to you guys, but I think narratives are probably the least, what's the way to say this? I think they're the most, I don't know how to word this. Probably the least effective expository preaching comes from narratives. I think I was going to say they're sort of the most abused passages, but I don't want to be too strong. But I do see a lot of weak sermons on narratives because the focus isn't on the story really. It's pulling out doctrinal truths from the story, or it's focusing on the main theme and using the story as an illustration, as opposed to just teach the story. Now, if you're teaching a New Testament passage on something and you want to use an Old Testament story to illustrate a point, that's okay to do. But what I'm talking about is if you're actually teaching that narrative text from the Old Testament, that it's a lot of times I see topical sermons really from narrative passages. where it's just focusing on the doctrinal truths rather than telling the story that leads us to the doctrinal truth the author wants us to see. All right. And that, I think, is the key. And so I have these questions in here, these guiding evaluation points, because I'm trying to help you structure your sermon in a certain way, to tell the story well. So the first part is, did you tell it well? Did you tell it clearly? The second one is, did you provide helpful illustrations or background insights? So, for example, if you're preaching from Jonah chapter 3, it might be helpful to, as you're talking about the king putting sackcloth and ashes on, it might be helpful at that point to step back and say, now, why did he do that? What is sackcloth? And was he talking about ashes like from a fire? Why would he throw ashes on his body? This is kind of strange. So that's where you might want to illustrate by explaining what that is, so that your hearers like, oh, okay, sackcloth was kind of this burlap material that wasn't clothing, but it demonstrated a person who was either in great mourning or a person who felt very guilty, so you would explain a little bit of that cultural practice. That's what I mean here by provide helpful illustrations and background insights, right? Because especially if you're in the Old Testament, you're going to be dealing with some cultural things that might not make sense to your hearers. So that would be, you want to illustrate by explaining what those things are. And Ruth, when Boaz, when they take the shoe off to make that agreement in Ruth chapter 4, what was all that about? And why did Boaz go to the city gates? Right? It would be helpful to let your people know, well, at the city gates, that's where judicial matters were settled. That's where financial business arrangements were made. That's where contracts were made, was at the city gates, because you had city leaders there who could serve as witnesses in those transactions. Okay. So that's what I mean here by helpful illustrations and background insights. All right. And then I already mentioned this. Did the preacher ask questions to draw his hearers into the story? I think those can be very effective. You don't have to ask a lot of questions, just a couple. Like, why did this person do that? Or why do you think the narrator mentioned this? That's kind of an odd. Or why did this character make that statement? That was kind of a strange. For example, if you're preaching from Exodus 32, remember what Aaron said when he was confronted? He said, well, I threw the gold in the fire and out came this calf. Like, what's he saying? Is he really saying that? Is he really trying to convince Moses that just the gold somehow made a calf by itself? Is that what he's saying here? You see what I mean? It kind of, some of you are laughing. Well, yeah, because it's like, that is funny. and it's sobering too, right? Because what's he doing there? He's trying to shift the blame, isn't he?
Pastor Tim, that's the
Yeah.
early lesson of evolution.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. God threw all these cells and proteins, carbon and oxygen together, and out came this cell. So those things make the story engaging, as opposed to just, like I said, three characteristics of God's wrath. Certainly you could find characteristics of God's wrath in the text, and certainly you could preach an accurate. You could preach the doctrine accurately, but my point is that what Moses was trying to do there? All right, that's the Holy Spirit led interpretation. That's what you want. That's what we want. We want to know, what is it that Spirit wanted the reader or the hearer to learn from this passage? All right, that's the Holy Spirit, the author intended meaning. That's the one you want, because that's where the power is. Because if it's, if the Spirit's saying, yes, Michael, you're correct. That's exactly what the point I was trying to make. That's what's empowered. Not if Michael's imposing a point that he wants to make that may be true, and God can use it, but it's not going to be the most effective because it's not the point that the Spirit intended. Okay? This is why I'm making such a big deal about this. Because God gave this passage, God gave Ruth 1 or Jonah 2 or Jonah 3, I'm sorry, Jonah 4, Ruth 4. He gave it in the form of narrative. All right? He did not give it in the form of an epistle. He could have, but he didn't. Why? Because he wanted the truth taught in the form of a story. Think about Jesus. We see God's heart in this very clearly in the Gospels. How many parables did he tell? He told a number of them. Why? Why didn't he just make the point? Because the effectiveness and the power of making the point through a story. You can remember a story. It's easy to follow a story. And it's easy to draw out and focus on a main point from a story. And that's exactly how we need to see the Old Testament narrative and New Testament narrative as well. It's a story meant to identify a particular point, sometimes other points, but usually there's one main idea that's being communicated through the story. That's what we want to get. And we want to tell the story in such a way that our people grab that point as well. Okay? So we get to that idea here. Did the preacher summarize the main point of the story in a timeless way? Now remember, in epistles, we'll usually put this up in the introduction because epistles are normally deductive sermons. But for a narrative, I put it in the body of the sermon because at some point you're drawing them to that main point. Now, again, you could say it at the beginning. That's fine. And that would be addressed here in evaluation. Or like I said, on an inductive sermon, you might say it towards the end. So I put it in the body as far as evaluation. Okay, let me stop here for a minute and ask, are there any questions on what we've talked about so far? Telling the story, illustrations, how those will be used within the narrative, asking questions, summarizing the main point. Any questions from you guys or comments?
So are we going to make the main point in every scene, something like that, or after the after we finish the three scenes, something like, and make a main point out of three scenes that we have, or every scene we're going to make a main point of that scene and in a timeless way, or
No, this is meant the main. Notice it says the main point of the story, not the scene. All right. Each scene builds towards the point of the story, right? The plot. So each scene, you're essentially developing the plot. So early on in the story, you'll be identifying the problem. Like in Jonah, the problem pops up right in the first two verses. Jonah said no to God. This is a problem. All right. How would God respond? Why did Jonah disobey God's command? What was the issue there? And Jonah, or God, as the story starts to develop, you see God doesn't judge Jonah right away. Remember, the storm on the sea was not God's judgment on Jonah. If it was, Jonah would have drowned. Most likely. God saved him.
yes,
So God wanted to teach Jonah something. I think the storm, this is my opinion, the storm is really meant more for the sailors than for Jonah. Because through that whole series of events, God used it to bring the sailors to himself. And he used it in Jonah's life to get his attention. Or try to get his attention. So, but this here, in regards to your question, Michael, did the preacher summarize the main point of the story in a timeless way? So the scenes are meant to help develop the plot of the story, and then the main point is what will come out at the end.
okay,
Okay? So you don't have to have like your outline points, you can have, basically your outline is your scenes. So the first scene of your story would maybe be Jonah rejects God's command. The second scene might be, the sailors fear for their lives in the storm while Jonah sleeps. And then you might have a third point where you break that scene up and say, that's the solution is to throw Jonah overboard or something. And then another scene might be that the sailor's response to God's calming of the sea. But you don't have to tell people that like in an epistle sermon. Like, okay, point number 1, point number 2, in a story, you tend to want to just say, okay, read the verses for the scene and then walk through the scene and then say, okay, so Jonah not only disobeys God, he runs the other direction and gets on a ship and goes out to sea. How's God going to respond? What's God going to do? Well, let's look in verse 4 and see how does God respond to Jonah, right? That's your transition. Instead of saying, okay, point number 1, Jonah disobeys. Let's look at point number 2, God's response. That's not storytelling. That's epistle telling. Again, you can do that, but I think it waters down the impact and the power of the sermon if you don't tell that as a story. Instead, I like to introduce questions like I just did with Jonah. How will God respond to this? Well, let's see what happens. Okay. And then now take a look with me at verse 4, and then you might read verses 4 to 7 or something like that. And then go through that part of the story. And then I think that's a better way to walk through a story. Break it up into pieces, and usually each scene is a good piece. Now, sometimes you have a long scene, or a scene might be 15 verses. Instead of reading all 15 verses, I would just try to find some good breakpoints. All right, like for example, in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman, instead of reading the whole dialogue between Jesus and the woman, I would break it up into those 3 questions, or those 3 parts, right? The first part's where Jesus tells her about the living water. And then the second part is where Jesus tells her, asks her about her husband. And then the third part is when the true worship, right? So I would break that's one scene, but I would break it up into those 3 parts. I wouldn't read the whole thing. Right? Again, that's just me. That's a style. But I think it's better when you're doing storytelling. If you read the whole thing, people, one, you're sort of giving away the whole story, but then also 2, if you read a long passage, people tend to not follow you as closely. They can drift off sometimes. Okay. So I like to tell, shorter, if I can. Now, sometimes if you're preaching like a long story, you may have to just grab pieces as you go. Like if you're preaching a few chapters, for whatever reason, that might be more difficult to read it. You won't be able to probably to read everything. Okay. Another good question. Any other questions?
Okay.
Okay. Did the preacher express the theological implications of the text in a timeless manner? Were there any doctrinal questions or concerns identified? Now, the intent of this one is basically with a story, as you get toward the end and you reveal the point of the story, there is going to be a theological truth, a doctrinal truth that the author is trying to show us. So, for example, if it's Exodus 32, one of the things would be God's response, to sin, to rebellion, the idea of God's wrath. And so that would be a point you might want to draw more out of, God's wrath. What is that? And why is God's wrath so strong? Why did so many people die, in Exodus 32? So you might draw out some of the theological implications there at the end as you're discussing the key idea. Okay. But again, I wouldn't necessarily draw those out as I'm telling the story. Now, sometimes you might, trying to think of an example. Yeah, like say the golden calf incident. You know, as they're making the calf, you might even in the middle of the story take a moment to say, okay, now do you think this is a problem? What did God have to say about making idols? And you might want to spend a moment and look at a couple of other passages just to sort of inform the importance of this issue. All right, you're not describing the main point at this time, but you might want to. There might be an opportunity to draw it, and you might even say at that point, now, can we today make idols in our life? You know, maybe not a golden calf, but are there things in our life which will draw our affection and our worship? You know, so from time to time, that's perfectly fine to take an aside if you feel it's important for your hearers to address that, okay? But don't make a whole sermon on that or take a lot of time necessarily. All I am saying is that it's okay if there are points along the way in the story that you feel are would be helpful to discuss with your hearers. But a lot of the doctrine is going to come at the end as you're drawing out the main point of the story. All right. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay. Did the preacher effectively transition from one scene to another? Okay, and there, like I said, do you do it in the way of a story? So this is how Jonah responded. Let's see, what's God going to do? You know, that's sort of that idea of a transition. Or from the first part of the story, we've seen this. Let's look to see what happens next. I mean, something like that, where you're clearly marking a point of transition from the scene you've just described moving to the next scene. Okay? And again, like I said, if you're telling a story, don't say, okay, the summary of scene number 1 is blah, 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 blah. Now let's look to scene number 2. Don't do it that way. That's not storytelling. Did the preacher provide areas of practical application or implication of the narrative to encourage the hearers to obey? Okay, and again, a lot of that probably will be towards the end as you reveal the main point of the narrative. That's where then you would explain that main point, maybe identify some of the doctrines that come out of that, and then you would move towards your hearers and how give them specific ways they can apply that point. As I mentioned earlier, if you're preaching from Exodus 32 and the wrath of God, you would want to talk to non-believers about that and how would they apply these principles, and to believers. Like I said, so does God's wrath abide on the believer? No. Jesus took God's wrath upon himself. So we never have to worry about God punishing us for our sin. And you might even at that point take them to another passage like the New Testament in 1 John chapter 4, where it says perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment. And you might talk about there, we don't have to fear God that we're going to be punished. You know, so you could use a New Testament text to sort of explain the doctrinal truth in more detail if you want. Okay? Any questions? All right. And then last but definitely not least, and I put this in the body because somewhere in your sermon you need to bring in the gospel. Okay? You've got to do this. You're a Christian preacher, so preach Christ. Now do it at an appropriate point in the message, and sometimes that would be at the end, but there might be other times where you would address the gospel, but make sure you do that always, every sermon, at some point in the sermon, preach the gospel. Okay, I know that it's probably an obvious point, but you'd be surprised how many times you might hear a sermon and there's really not a clear gospel call within the sermon. Okay, never assume everyone listening to you is a Christian. And it's also very helpful for believers to kind of see how the gospel is connected to the particular text that you're preaching. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus, is in every passage and try to, find a type of Christ in your text. I'm not saying that at all, but every passage will lead us to some extent. The gospel will be connected. Christ will be connected in some way, either by an illustration, right? Like, for example, the golden calf. There's nowhere in that passage that mentions Christ. There's nowhere in that passage that talks about the Messiah. But does the wrath of God relate to the gospel? You bet, right? There's a problem. We all have a problem. We're sinners, and our sin deserves God's wrath, right? You're at the gospel right there. So make sure you don't neglect that. Okay, even for this exercise, if you're just recording the sermon for me, I still want you to, I want to see where you would identify and bring out the gospel in that passage. Okay. All right. Any questions on the body of the sermon or comments? Okay. Conclusion. Fairly straightforward. Good morning, Pastor Bobby. Good to see you.
Good morning, Pastor Tim. I'm sorry I'm late.
No problem. What I decided to do today, I just wanted to cover the sermon evaluation form so that when you guys get your feedback from your sermons, I'm trying to, show you what I'm looking for so that hopefully my comments to you guys in your sermons will make a little more sense. And I should have probably done this earlier, but I didn't have time last week. So you can still apply these things to the next one. And I'm recorded this so everyone can take a look later if they want. Okay, so conclusion. What I'm looking for, I think an effective conclusion is, did the preacher state the main point of the narrative in a memorable way? All right. So you may have already given the main point in the beginning of the sermon, if it's a deductive sermon. If it's inductive, you're leading them to the point, and you may have given it toward the end of the body of your sermon, or you might wait till the conclusion. That's okay for a story. But there in the conclusion, then you're going to have to also incorporate the application, the theological implications. So it'll be a little longer conclusion, but the main point needs to be clearly stated. Did the preacher make a direct appeal to apply the point of the passage? Again, with a narrative, it's helpful to, bring them to that main point. And once you've clarified that main point, then calling them to respond and how do they apply that point. And then, did the preacher end the message effectively? And there, what I'm talking about is, rather than just saying, we're done or you're dismissed, or, is there a transition at the end, either with a story, a song, a poem, a time of prayer, reflective question, benediction, something like that, where you bring closure to that message, but you do it in such a way that you don't just move on to the next thing. To me, I think going to announcements or something like that at the close of your sermon is not a good idea. You don't want them moving away from your text too quickly. I just watched Pastor Bobby's sermon. I thought that was a good way that you ended that sermon effectively. You brought that story in of Keith and Melody Green, which was really good. And then, there was a Redeemer, that song that they wrote together. So that totally fit with where you were headed with the sermon, and then you ended with a benediction. So that was a good example of as my preaching professor would say, landing the plane well. All right. You didn't crash the plane. So make sure that you think about that. How is this sermon going to end? What thought do I want to leave this person with? And sometimes it's good just to lead a time of reflective prayer. Just say, I want to give you a moment, and have you really thought about, whatever it is, the compassion of God and what that means for you? Have you displayed that compassion in your own life? I want to give you a moment just to talk to God about that. All right. So, there's many ways to end a sermon well. Just make sure you do that. So this is what the point of this question or evaluation point is. Did you end the message effectively? Okay. And again, conclusions normally, are fairly short, but again, with a narrative text, you might have a longer conclusion if that's where you unveil the main point of your passage. Okay. All right. Any thoughts or questions on the conclusion? All right, let me move to the exegesis. Now, again, the body of the sermon, what we're looking for is the clarity. How clear was your storytelling? How clear were as you walk through the scenes of the story? Illustrations. Did you do those things to make it more clear, more understandable? Now, the exegesis, I'll be looking at what you said as far as the accuracy. So, for example, did the preacher correctly understand the main point of the passage? I've mentioned Exodus 32 as sort of an example through our discussion this morning. I listened to a message from a guy on Exodus 32. He began the sermon on the golden calf, right? Which was not a great a high point in Israel's history. It was a pretty sobering event, right? Well, he starts his sermon, he's playing a piano, and he's playing like some jazz song, it's kind of upbeat. I'm thinking this is an odd way to start any sermon, but really odd way to start a sermon that's from Exodus 32. And all through the sermon, he's telling jokes. And, it's kind of a lot of levity but I'm thinking, the tone of this passage it's not funny. It's pretty serious. And then he tries to make it seem like the Israelites really, he said, how can you blame them for what they did? I mean, Moses was gone and they hadn't heard from God. So of course they were going to, wonder. And he almost tried to justify their making the calf and how they responded. I mean, he totally missed the passage, totally missed it. All right. And in fact, I thought was pretty irreverent through it, frankly. But so we don't want to be that guy. We want to clearly demonstrate we understand the main point of this story, of this text. And then the second part is, did the preacher correctly understand the setting of the story, how it related to its main point? This goes back sort of to the introduction. Did you introduce your audience, your hearers, to the background of the story enough so that they would understand what's going on in the story? So if you're teaching a passage like from, a later chapter in the story, you're going to have to sort of effectively bring them to that point in your story. So if you're preaching from Jonah 3, you don't want to just start in Jonah 3 verse 1. You might read that at the beginning, but you got to go, okay, now where are we here? Jonah here's preaching to the Ninevites, but there's some things that have happened that you need to know about before we dive into this story. So, and then you might either take them back and read a verse or two, but you want to give them the setting of the story so that they understand what's going on in the chapter that you're focusing on. Now you got to be careful and not sort of take a lot of time doing that, but you want to pick out the key events that have taken place. And like I said, in Ruth, for example, it's really important that the people understand the historical setting there in the time of the judges and the significance of that in relation to these two women and the situation that they are in. Because as the story unfolds, we see how God sovereignly ordains the care of these two women. And then that is a picture of God's care for Israel by providing them the offspring of these two women in King David. And then we as Christians can take a further step back and say, and really, the book of Ruth didn't stop there. David had more descendants, and we could bring in God's care not only for Naomi and Ruth in their desperate situation, but his care for the people of Israel in their desperate situation. And then finally, this is a picture of God's care for all of us in our desperate situation. Okay? And I think that's how I would go through that. But they need to understand in the story, what is the desperate situation these women face? Not just that they lost their husbands, but these women are living in the time of the judges with no one for protection, with no one to care for them, with no one to provide for them. They're in a serious situation. So that's what you're going to want to do there. And Jonah, the setting is really going to be related to who the Ninevites, why, and Jonah's refusal to follow God's instruction, and how that then brings to chapter 3, where he eventually does obey, but it's not with a repentant heart. And that's revealed from chapter 4. So the setting of the story, that's an important element. So did the preacher correctly understand that setting and how it's connected to the main point? Any questions or comments on these first two points here? Okay. Now this third one, I really want to, I've seen a lot of narrative sermons over the years in teaching this course and in just church. I'm pretty surprised at how little the narrator comments are noted in those sermons. I already talked about this a little earlier, so I'm not going to beat that point again, but I put in a specific evaluation point here is to, are you identifying key narrator comments? Not every narrator comment, but every story, there's going to be something that he describes, something that he notes. Perhaps it's something a character does. Perhaps it's something a character thought. Perhaps it's a particular setting that he points out. For example, in John chapter 4, and I forget the verse, but remember the verse where it said, the woman tells Jesus, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink?" And then John puts in that narrator comment where he says, Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. That was a significant statement by the narrator. In fact, he's identifying the problem of this passage, of the story there. And so to preach John 4, you've got to mention that. Because that's part of what the whole problem was in that account. Or later when the narrator says, the disciples returned, but they didn't ask Jesus why he was speaking to this woman. That's a significant statement the narrator was giving us. And so again, I'm not saying point out every narrator comment, but you should understand the story well enough that which narrator comments are significant. And those are ones that you will want to draw the attention of your hearers to. Now, you don't need to necessarily explain it, but you might say things like, notice here, did you see where, in this case, John points out, he makes this statement that Jews don't have dealings with Samaritans. Why do you think, what did that mean? Why did he make that statement here? What's John trying to show us in this? Okay. And so I think it's very important, you know, as you go through the narrative analysis, there's two different times in the scene analysis, I tell you to comment on the narrator, and in the character analysis, I tell you to comment on the narrator. There's a reason for that. The narrator is a very important part of the story. And he often is the one who directs our attention to what he wants us to see in the story. So make sure that this is, again, remember I told you before, as you preach the sermon, hopefully you're helping your hearers know how to read stories from the Bible. You're teaching them the hermeneutics of interpreting narratives by how you preach. And so when you have a practice of drawing their attention to narrator comments, guess what they're going to be more sensitive to as they read on their own biblical stories? All right? You want to teach them the importance of what the narrator says. Okay? So, and often too, again, he'll make comments that direct our attention to the key point of the story. In John chapter 9, there are several statements by the narrator about using the word sent. For example, it says there that Jesus sent the blind man to the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So Jesus sent the blind man to the pool of sent. That word's repeated several times. So you're going to want to note that as you're preaching through that sermon, notice the narrator here tells us, he interprets for us, or tells us exactly where the blind man was sent. Why would he do that? Why does that matter? Why didn't the narrator just say, so he went to a pool to wash himself? Why did Jesus tell him to go to that particular pool? Okay? When you understand the main point of the story and you go back, you'll see these I might call them beacons, of the narrator, where he's saying, look at this, this is important, this is important. All right? Okay, I'm beating a dead horse here, so let me move on, unless there's any questions on that. Okay. I'm going to assume, with no questions, I'm going to assume that means you just understand, not that you're bored. Okay. All right. Let's go to, okay. Did the preacher correctly identify the scenes of the story, how they contributed to the main point? Again, just as you're walking through the story, I don't mean, summarizing each scene, telling them, so the first scene, the summary of that scene is this. What I mean is just, is it clear that you've broken up the story and told it that way, rather than, reading a large chunk or just going verse by verse, but that you've identified each scene and you tell the story scene by scene. Or like I said, if there's a long scene, that you've broken it up appropriately, to tell it in an effective way. Did the preacher correctly understand how the story fits within the purpose and flow of the book? Again, that's kind of, as you're telling the story, do you make connections with perhaps other parts of the book? Right? And especially in Jonah and Ruth, you should be doing that, because really it's one story. Like Jonah's one story with four acts. Ruth is one story with 4 acts, each chapter. And they're interconnected. You can't disconnect them from it. So if you're preaching one chapter, you have to understand how it fits with the whole. Is that something that's clear, that you understand that from the sermon? And then last but not least, I just have an evaluation point here. Did the preacher include too much of his exegetical study into the sermon? Are you pronouncing all the Hebrew words and giving the word studies? Are you talking about, the plot analysis, and identifying each part of the plot? Now, here's the introduction to this story, and here's the problem in the story. Here's the rising action of the story. Here's the climax. Are you preaching too much technical stuff, or are you just telling the story and the point that it brings and how to apply it? Okay. We just want to be careful with that. Or, if you're giving a background on the Ninevites, you start talking. So the empire of Nineveh, of Assyria, would begin probably around 850 BC, during the time of this king, King Ashurnabal, and he won the battle at this city, and you get into all this historical detail, and that might be interesting to one other person in the whole congregation, but be careful with that. So that's what I mean by too academic. All right. Okay. Questions? Cries of suffering? Comments?
It's a good thing, Pastor Tim, that there is a time limit of 35 minutes, because if not, I could have been lost also with all of those details.
I forgot to put on
The big
ahead.
challenge was really how to compress the sermon.
No, I was impressed, honestly. Because I looked at your total time and I thought, really? Wow. Pastor Bobby preached a sermon in less than 40 minutes. That is quite amazing.
Hallelujah. Praise God.
Praise God. Yeah, that was my favorite part.
Record breaking.
See, remember I told you, I said, I know you can do this. So I'm impressed. You did it by the third sermon, actually. Okay. And then last but not least, and I won't spend much time on these just because we've already talked about them. I think they're obvious. Eye contact, gestures, how do you use your hand? Some of you guys I've noticed, especially if you're holding a microphone, you'll have the other hand down here. Well, use your other hand. Even if you can't move one of them because you have a microphone, you can still use the other one, right? I mean, I can talk for a minute here and I can give you 3 reasons how you can use your free hand to communicate. All right. And then you could switch the microphone, use your other hand. But don't just, hold your hands at your side, or even if you have a microphone, I see some guys, they sort of grab the pulpit or, this is part of the body language that you have to communicate. All right. So voice and passion, learn how to vary the tone, the volume, the pace of your voice. I think Pastor Bobby's sermon this week was a really good example of that. How just by the way he varied his tone, and at times there was some emphasis, he paused, just good example of sort of how to use your voice effectively. And then the last part I sort of added is more of a general question. Is there anything the preacher does that is a distraction? Sometimes there's certain habits maybe that you have or things you do that can be a distraction. So that's kind of what that's meant to cover. All right. Any questions on delivery? Notice it's not, it's 14 points, so it's a decent amount of the sermon, but it's not, the biggest parts are, 1, the exegesis, that's a third of your sermon grade. The body of your sermon, the clarity and how well you tell the story and all of that, that's another third. And then basically the introduction, the conclusion, and the delivery is the last third.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
the delivery is quite hard because it is delivered online.
Yeah. I know that. I've preached a lot of messages online, recorded a lot of messages. Churches that have asked me to to preach, and they'll say, "But can you record it?" It's like, oh. But what I tell myself or remind myself is, even though it's being recorded, somebody's watching this. There is an audience. Now, maybe I can't see them. I don't know who they are necessarily. I don't know when they're going to be watching, but I just assume there is an audience. And so I do all this stuff, the delivery. I don't change anything. I just preach at the camera and just assume there's a bunch of people looking at me through that camera and they're watching, even if it's going to be, 2 weeks later, because it's a recording. So I think you need to just remind yourself of that. Don't think of it as a recording. And right now, nobody's watching except people who've got spyware on your computer. But, nobody else is watching. Well, that's not true. God's always watching. We know that. But also, too, others are watching. Now, if you're just recording it for me, I'm watching. And I want to be blessed and challenged by the word of God. Okay? So you need to preach, even if it's just one person is going to see this, you are communicating the word of God. And that is a somber responsibility, whether one person is listening or, 100,000 people. Yeah. Let me give you an illustration of that. Right. The Marianas Trench. You guys know where that is, right? Deepest part of the ocean, not far from the I think it's actually, is it part of the Philippines or part of Japan? I can't remember. It's further
Philippines.
north, right?
It's Philippines, Pastor, near Brillo's home.
Philippines.
Okay.
Surigao.
Oh, that's right. So I watched a documentary one time, because the big challenge was trying to build a submarine that could go down to the bottom there to record, to see what's there. And so there's the documentary, all these guys tried. Well, one guy figured out how to build a certain submarine to do that. I think it was unmanned. And they went down there, turned on the lights, and there was all these weird creatures at the bottom of this, 10-kilometer deep trench. And, I thought about how many creatures on the earth are never seen by a human being. And yet those creatures give God glory in their very existence because God sees them and he made them. And even if no human eye sees, one of these strange creatures existing at the bottom of this trench, it still gives God glory that creature exists because he sees it. And he made it. And I think of that, that even if God's the only one watching, if you accurately proclaim his truth, that gives him glory. If no human being ever heard it, it still honors him. Now, in the case of these sermons, at least one human being is going to hear it because I am. So, like I said, I want to be blessed and encouraged. And I want to, keep that in mind. But some of you're preaching these messages to a group of people or recording it for a group of people. So there is an audience. And there's a reason then to preach the sermon with the conviction and the passion and the, because that's what will honor God in how you present his word, even if no one else sees it. So just my encouragement to you, it is hard. It's harder to do that. But that's kind of how I remind myself. And I think that helps me to preach as if I'm there in front of a group of people. So I don't know if that's helpful to you or not, Sid, but that's something I tell myself.
Pastor Tim, that's encouraging. That will give us a new perspective for this platform.
Good. And it might be something, one of you, I think one of you maybe it was you, Brother Arn, I can't remember, said that you recorded and you'll use it maybe to share with other family members, and so maybe there's something as you record this message and you could use it in other ways that you maybe didn't think of down later on. So keep that in mind as well.
He made it available in FB, Pastor Tim.
Okay, good.
Pastor Brother Arn.
Yeah.
She's laughing, oh. That betrayed his sincerity.
So, okay. Well, I know that, may not have been the most exciting topic to cover, but I do want you to understand the evaluation form and the intent behind it and what we're trying to encourage through it. Now, each genre will have many similarities, but there will be some distinct differences because, for example, in poetry, we're going to add a couple of parts to the exegesis regarding figurative language and things like that. Obviously, in narrative, there's components of storytelling that we incorporate into but basically, delivery is going to be the same, evaluating points for whatever genre. Any sermon, no matter what genre you're preaching, do you have eye contact? Are you using gestures? Is there passion, conviction? I mean, that's going to apply to any type of genre. The introduction, it's going to be basically the same for any type of genre. Are you getting attention of the hearers? Are you surfacing a need? Do you effectively transition to the text? Okay. Illustration, application. Those are going to be needed in any genre that you teach. Conclusion is going to be the same essentially for every genre. So there's a lot of similarities, but there are a few distinct differences depending on the genre that we have. So like I said, if you've already preached your sermon and I talked about something today and you're going, oh, I don't think I did that. Oh, it's okay. Well, you have another shot with the preaching from John. And also too, I'll make comment if I don't see a particular part in your thing. I'll put some comments in there as I give you your evaluation. So this is all, to learn to be better. Okay. Any last questions before I go to our schedule? Any questions regarding sermon or regarding your sermon? Anything? Okay.
Pastor, you
Pastor
said
Tim,
earlier that you have a new,
Oh, sorry.
set of, or I think, schedule.
Yeah, I'm going to cover talk about the
We have
schedule in a minute
you
here.
have-
Yeah. You want to hear that, huh? Okay. Sure. Did somebody else have a question
No.
now?
Just
no, I was just going to make a comment, Pastor Tim.
Sure, go ahead.
We would like to appreciate the sermon evaluation sheet. I plan to implement it to the rest of the congregation. But my purpose is this, Pastor Tim. I want to find out in the congregation who is for me and who is against me.
There you go. Who are the troublemakers? Who are the problems? Okay. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I had a couple of, I modified the schedule a little bit again that I wanted to show you. So again, there's many of you have turned in your sermons. I got several yesterday, so that's good. There's a couple of you still working on that. So what I want to do is give an opportunity twofold. One is for those of you who haven't completed your sermon, you've got a few more days this week to do that. Then I want to give enough time so that you're ready for the background and literary context of the New Testament passage, because that that first assignment can take a little more time because it's a background and literary context. So I wanted to give next week to you as sort of a study week to prepare for that. And then I'll be discussing the details of that assignment 1 the following week on February 2nd. Okay. So that basically gives an extra week there for preparation to catch up and then to get going on the John text. Now, I'll give you a hint as well. We covered a lot of this in our first session in our workshop, because John was the passage I used, John 4, in covering the workshop, content. And at the beginning, we talked about background and literary context of John. So you're going to want to go back to that and look at the notes. That'll give you a lot of helpful resources for your preparation for that first assignment. Okay? And again, that is the background and literary context of the book, not just your passage. Okay? So I just want to let you know about that. I want to give you a little extra time. We'll still be on track to begin Module 3 in April, and I might have to change this because I can't remember the dates for Passion Week. So we may adjust the schedule a little bit because I know that's an important time, and you'll need time to serve the church. So we may move a few of these dates around a little bit. I think is Resurrection Sunday the first Sunday of April? Do you guys know? Anybody know?
I'm not aware, Pastor Tim, but we'll find that out and we'll get back to you immediately.
Yeah, let me just, I can look it up real quick here. April 4th. Okay, so what we'll probably do is I'll probably, we'll push this second preaching lab out a week because this is Passion Week here. So we'll probably move that out a week so we don't interfere with Passion Week and not meet that week, but meet the Tuesday after. Okay, so I'll adjust that as well. That's the only change I can foresee right now. And so what we'll do with these during these weeks is I'll spend, like last time, we'll go back to some topics in our study of narratives because we still haven't talked about word studies. We got caught in the block diagramming and English grammar for a while. So there are some other features, though, of the narrative, the word studies, coming up with the author's main point, those kinds of things that I want to go back to. So we'll spend a little time on those elements of studying a narrative, and then we'll talk about the assignment and the format there. And just if there's any questions you have on your passage, that'll be the time you can ask me about that. So we'll continue with that format going on through February and March. Okay. All right.
Pastor Tim.
Yes.
Pastor Tim. As I open Canvas, I noticed there is the passage about some. Do we need to do that yet?
Oh, which for module 3?
I don't know if it's module 3, but that's Psalms. And the deadline is December 31. We are not going to do that yet.
No, is that when the Canvas, because the problem is there's two Canvas.
I open Canvas module 2.
Okay. And what was there?
Psalms, a passage about Psalms.
Well, let me open that up for a second here.
Okay.
Canvas. So module
Module
2.
2.
So the canvas.instructure.com. That one.
Yeah, there's in the assignment part there is Psalms.
Oh, I think yeah, hold on. I think I know what you're talking about. I think that's just a typo. Okay.
I just inquired because we are not yet talking about Psalms.
Yeah, it's probably where I had you give the sermon link.
Yes, maybe in the sermon link.
Give a link. Oh, yeah. That should read of your here. I'm going to change it right now. Yeah, I miss yeah, that should be provide a link to a video of your sermon for your Ruth Jonah passage.
Yes.
So that's my fault.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay, I'll check the other one. Make sure it doesn't have the same problem. Yeah, that's where I just asked you if you guys, some of you have sent me your links directly, like on Facebook or something. So that's perfectly fine too, to do that as well. But yeah, I also did that for the John sermon. So let me change that. Okay. All right. Thank you, Sid. I appreciate that. I fixed that. Okay. Last chance. If anybody has a question or a comment, I'll try to send out an updated schedule to you guys with and I'll look at the Passion Week and make adjustments for that as well. If there's any other adjustments needed, let me know. If you have any particular church activities that are going to require a lot of your time, and just let me know about that, and I can see about adjusting schedule. My goal is that we're definitely started in module 3 by April, some point in April. So that way, hopefully, if the door opens up for travel in the fall, we can be back on track by October. But we'll see. Okay. Any last questions or comments, concerns? I'm sorry, Pastor Bobby, you're muted. What's that? Forget it. You're still on mute.
Let me take the opportunity, Pastor Tim, in the presence of the others. We're sending a little gift to you as gathered
Oh.
from the others. So we would like to just show a little token of appreciation, Pastor Tim.
Oh, thank
It's
you.
just a small, but we hope, you would appreciate it.
That's
As
very
Michael
kind.
is taking care of it now.
Oh, okay. Wow, thank you very much. That's definitely appreciated, and
It comes from all of us, Pastor Tim.
that means a lot. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Amen.
Pastor Bobby, would you mind praying for us this week, unless you have any final thoughts or comments?
Yeah. I'm sorry again, I was late because